The air inside the Naval Joint Command Center felt heavy, charged with the kind of confidence that only years of deployment could shape. Rows of uniforms filled the glass briefing room, sunlight glinting off nameplates and medals. The murmur of conversation dropped as the door opened at exactly 9:30 a.m. First Lieutenant Emily Carter stepped in. Air uniform crisp, a clipboard tucked under her arm, her eyes steady. She carried herself like someone who had once known flight, and even the way she moved had precision written into it. From the front row, Commander Daniel Hayes leaned back in his chair. His voice carried just enough for the men around him to hear as he mentioned her call sign. Iron Raven. Laughter followed, low at first, then spreading in quiet ripples across the room. A Marine whispered that it sounded like a comic book hero. Another added that maybe she had picked it herself. Emily didn't react. She simply connected the data cable, adjusted the projector, and began setting up her slides. The machine hummed to life, casting a pale blue light across the polished table. For a few moments, the only sounds were the whir of the fan and the faint shuffle of boots. The laughter faded, but its echo lingered, hanging in the air like smoke. Hayes smirked. Watching her from his seat, he expected a nervous glance, maybe a stammer. But Emily offered neither. Her hands moved with quiet confidence, checking system diagnostics. Her focus locked on the task. The screen blinked, revealing a tactical map of the Persian Gulf, color-coded with flight corridors and convoy routes. She began to speak, her tone even, her sentences clipped and deliberate. Every word was measured, stripped of emotion. The way a pilot speaks when focus matters more than approval. Around here, the men shifted in their chairs, pretending to listen while still nursing their own amusement. Yet the room was changing. The light from the projector caught the sharp edge of her profile, and the calm in her posture pressed against the noise. Even the hum of the system seemed to bend to her rhythm. When she finished the opening summary, there was no applause. Only silence. Commander Hayes looked up, his grin smaller now, his expression harder to read. Emily powered down the projector, gathered her notes, and gave a small nod before stepping aside. The moment passed without fanfare, but something had shifted. They still saw her as an outsider, a desk officer among warriors. Yet none could shake the quiet certainty she left behind. The Iron Raven had entered their world without a sound, and for now, silence was her armor. Emily arrived at the base before the sun cleared the horizon. The clock on her desk read 5:45 a.m., but she didn't need it to tell her she was early. The sky outside the window was still gray, streaked with the first trace of dawn. She set her coffee down beside the console and began reviewing ISR drone footage, frame by frame. Each line of telemetry data flickering across the monitor. It was a rhythm she had learned to live by. Quiet, disciplined, almost surgical in precision. Her eyes caught a small anomaly buried deep in the data feed. The crossfeed alignment on one of the UAVs was drifting a few degrees east. Nothing dramatic, but enough to throw off real-time imaging. She noted it on her tablet, tagged the report, and sent a quiet update to the maintenance team. No one thanked her. At the operations desk, two younger officers whispered about how she still worked like she was flying combat sorties. One of them called her a desk pilot, and the other laughed. The words carried just far enough for her to hear, but she didn't turn around. Instead, she adjusted the playback and kept watching the drone's flight path stabilize after correction. Her office was small, tucked into the corner of the operations building, with a wide window overlooking the runway. The walls were bare, except for a single shelf holding her old helmet. The Iron Raven insignia was nearly gone. Scratched and faded from years of heat and sand, she kept it polished out of habit. Not sentiment, When the light hit the visor just right, she could still see faint scratches from her last mission. The one that ended everything. Beneath the sleeve of her uniform, thin scars traced along her forearm. Pale reminders of a crash she never talked about. She rolled the fabric down before anyone could notice. Outside, the sound of an aircraft engine rolled across the tarmac. She looked up from the monitor, watching through the glass as a training jet lifted off, its wheels leaving the ground in a smooth climb. For a long moment, she followed it with her eyes. Not with envy, but with a steady calm. That world belonged to someone else now. She turned back to her screen, the hum of the bass filling the silence, and returned to work as the coffee beside her went cold. The Joint Operations Simulation Room was a hive of noise and confidence. Rows of screens glowed in soft blue light, reflecting off the glass walls and the steel badges on every chest. Marines joked. SEALs adjusted their headsets, and a few Air Force officers checked their notes. The exercise was scheduled to start at 800 hours, and the energy in the room felt like the start of a real mission. Emily Carter stood near the back, tablet in hand, reviewing her Raven Link protocol. It was a system designed to eliminate frequency overlap and reduce latency in real-time coordination between ground and air units. When it was her turn to present, she stepped forward and spoke in her usual calm tone. Her words were clear, simple, and to the point. The Raven Link would prevent communication interference, she said, ensuring seamless UAV relay between the C2 uplink and convoy command, commanded Daniel Hayes, leaning against the console, smiled as she spoke. His voice carried over hers with a trace of humor. He told the group they'd stick with the standard method, the one everyone was trained on. He called it keeping things realistic. A few of the Marines laughed under their breath. Emily replied evenly that without the filter, they would lose signal within 90 seconds. Hayes waved a hand and ordered the simulation to begin. The lights dimmed. The sound of engines filled the room through the speakers, layered with the faint hiss of open radio channels. Drone feeds came alive on the tactical map, showing a convoy of armored vehicles moving across a simulated desert. The first few minutes were smooth. Pilots called in status updates, and data streams looked stable. Then, just as Emily had warned, a flicker rippled across the feed. The convoy's position blinked, then froze. A second later, the drone cameras went dark. The room shifted from confidence to confusion. Voices rose as the operators checked connections and reset channels. Hayes barked orders to his tech team, demanding a system check. The AI voice cut through the noise, flat and mechanical, announcing mission failure. The convoy had been lost. Alarms echoed for a moment, then silence took over. The blue light from the monitors cast pale shadows across the room. Hayes muttered that it must have been a software bug and turned toward Emily, irritation tightening his jaw. She stood still, her face neutral, her eyes on the frozen screen, without saying a word. She tapped her tablet and began recording data. Her posture didn't shift. Her voice didn't rise. The sound of her pen on paper seemed louder than the murmurs filling the room. She made one final note at the bottom of the page before closing her log. Failure predicted. Recommendation ignored. Around here, the operators avoided her gaze, returning to their consoles in embarrassed silence. Hayes gave a short order to reset the system, but no one spoke again. Emily stepped aside, watching the reflection of the blue light fade from the monitor. Her expression unreadable. The room, once filled with noise and bravado, now carried only the low hum of cooling fans and the faint sound of regret. The Joint Operations Simulation Room buzzed with activity as the day's exercise began. The air smelled faintly of metal and burnt coffee, a mix familiar to every service member who had spent too many hours under fluorescent lights. The walls were lined with screens glowing blue, their data feeds streaming telemetry and drone visuals. SEALs, Marines, and Air Force techs filled the space, each group carrying its own brand of confidence. At the center stood Commander Daniel Hayes, arms crossed, voice steady with authority. Emily Carter waited quietly near the back, her tablet balanced against her forearm. The briefing started at 900 hours sharp. Hayes outlined the mission: protect a convoy moving through a simulated hostile corridor. Emily was invited to add technical notes, and she described her Raven Link protocol in calm, measured tones. It was a communication overlay designed to filter signal overlap and reduce mission latency by syncing C2 uplink timing across all frequencies. She explained that without the filter, interference could block UAV relay within a minute and a half. Hayes smiled in that way people do when they've already decided what they think. He said the team would stick to standard procedure, claiming that realism meant working through flaws. A few Marines chuckled. Emily only nodded and stepped back. The simulation began. Headsets clicked on. The dark room filled with low voices and the hum of electronics. On the primary screen, the convoy moved through a flat expanse of desert terrain, while UAVs tracked from above. For the first 60 seconds, everything looked perfect. Then the static started. The feed from the first drone froze mid-transmission, followed by the second. Red indicators flashed on the main display, one after another. The convoy's position disappeared from the map. Someone cursed under their breath. Hayes barked orders to his technicians. They scrambled at the control stations, fingers flying over keys, trying to reconnect to the uplink. The AI system voice cut in cold and mechanical, announcing mission failure. For a long moment, the only sound was the low hum of the cooling systems. Hayes turned toward Emily, irritation visible in his jawline. He muttered something about software glitches. She met his eyes briefly but said nothing. Instead, she opened her logbook and started writing. The room felt smaller now, the silence heavier than before. No one dared to joke. The younger Marines avoided looking at her, suddenly aware that every problem she had predicted had come true. Emily's expression didn't change. She noted the exact time of the failure, wrote down the system response, and ended her report with a single line: failure predicted, recommendation ignored. When she closed the notebook, the faint snap of its cover echoed louder than any voice in the room. The blue light from the monitors flickered across her face as she stepped away, leaving behind a silence thick with embarrassment. She didn't need to say a word. The data had already spoken for her. The hangar was alive with motion and noise. The smell of oil and steel hung in the air as maintenance crews worked along the flight line, their voices echoing between the high walls. Outside, rain tapped steadily against the metal roof, a slow rhythm that blended with the hum of generators and the clatter of tools. Emily Carter stood beside a control rig, overseeing a UAV calibration test. Her jacket hung loosely over the back of a nearby chair, its faded patches catching the dim light. A young Marine corporal approached with a maintenance report in hand. As he reached for the clipboard on her desk, his eyes caught the inside of her jacket. Sewn just beneath the lining was an old, frayed patch, a black iron raven clutching a lightning bolt. The edges were worn and sand-stained, its stitching rough from years of heat and use. He paused, frowning, recognition flickering across his face. When he asked about it, Emily followed his gaze and replied softly that it was just an old unit insignia. Her voice was steady, but something unreadable passed through her eyes before she folded the jacket neatly over her arm. The corporal hesitated, then whispered that the emblem belonged to Task Force Iron Raven, a unit that was supposed to be classified. He said the words quietly, almost afraid to finish them. Everyone knew the stories: a rapid response, a 10 squadron that vanished during Operation Crosswind years ago. Officially, the entire team had been listed as KIA after their aircraft disappeared in the desert. No one knew what really happened. Within an hour, the rumor had spread across the base like static through an open channel. Pilots and Marines whispered that she couldn't be the same Emily Carter from that mission. The Air Force had closed the file long ago. Later that evening, Emily walked through the main hallway of the operations wing. The corridor was lined with bronze plaques and engraved names, a quiet tribute to those who had not come home. Her footsteps echoed softly against the floor, each one measured and deliberate. She slowed as she reached the far wall and saw it her own name etched into a polished plate. Captain Emily Carter, Kia, Operation Crosswind. The light caught the metal, reflecting faintly against her face. For a moment, she stood still, her expression unreadable. Alive, yet erased. The silence around her deepened until another officer came around the corner. He stopped, noticing her gaze, and asked if she was all right. Emily didn't look away from the plaque. She said it was a long time ago. Her tone quiet and even, then turned and walked down the hall. The echo of her boots faded, leaving behind only the soft hum of the bass and the rain against the windows. Behind her, the plaque stayed untouched. Her name remained where the world had left it, carved among the fallen, while the woman herself kept walking. A ghost still serving among the living. The base command center pulsed with low light and steady noise. Screens lined the walls, displaying tactical grids and real-time data streams as dozens of operators prepared for the largest joint simulation of the quarter. Navy, Marine, and Air Force officers filled the room, their focus locked on the convoy route, projected across a map of desert terrain. Commander Daniel Hayes stood at the head of the operations floor, radiating control. Emily Carter sat quietly near the back. Assigned as an observer after her successful live demo, it was the polite way of saying stay out of the way. The mission started at precisely 900 hours. A digital convoy of armored transports moved across the sand while drones monitored from overhead. The soft whir of cooling fans and the quiet chatter of headsets filled the space. For the first 10 minutes, the operation ran flawlessly. The convoy adjusted formation, the UAV feed stabilized, and the command team exchanged confident nods. Emily watched silently, her eyes scanning the telemetry data scrolling down her tablet. Then a flicker crossed the main screen. One of the UAV channels cut out, then another. Within seconds, every drone feed went black. A wave of confusion rippled through the room. Hayes barked orders at his technicians, demanding an uplink reset. Fingers flew over consoles. Cables were checked, but nothing changed. The screens glowed an empty blue. The satellite overlay failed, and the convoy's position vanished. Voices overlapped in rising panic. As the simulation AI announced mission failure, Hayes slammed his headset down, muttering about faulty software. Then turned toward Emily with a thin smile. If your system's so perfect, he said, maybe you can fix this one too. Emily didn't answer. She stood, walked to the central console, and knelt beside the main data rack. Her movements were calm, methodical. She unplugged the overloaded uplink cable and rerouted it through an auxiliary C2 channel that hadn't been used in years. A soft tone signaled reconnection. The screens flickered, then stabilized. The feeds came back online one by one, sharper than before. The room fell completely silent as the mission resumed without lag. Emily's hands moved across the interface, entering command codes in a low, sure voice. Her tone changed as she worked. It wasn't the measured voice of an analyst anymore. It was clipped, precise, and confident. The rhythm of someone who had commanded real aircraft under fire. She issued directives to the system. Raven 3. Shift vector to Bravo 9. Crosswind formation. Stabilize on grid delta. The words froze several seals mid-motion. One of the older men leaned toward Hayes and whispered that those call signs came from Operation Crosswind. The silence deepened. Everyone in the room knew that name. A mission buried under classified reports. One, no pilot had ever survived. Hayes stared at her, his voice suddenly quieter. Asking where she learned those codes, Emily didn't look up. Her fingers moved across the screen until the simulation ended. The main display flashed in bold green text. Mission success. 0 casualties. Record time. For a moment, no one breathed. The only sound was the steady hum of machinery and the faint patter of rain against the windows. Emily closed the console and straightened. Her eyes lifted briefly to meet Hayes's. Calm and unreadable, "Protocol still works," she said softly. Then she walked back to her seat, leaving the room in stunned silence. Around her, every officer sat motionless, realizing the woman they had dismissed was no analyst at all. The legend they thought had died over the desert had just taken command again. The room was still. The tactical screens had gone dark, leaving only the faint hum of machines and the soft patter of rain against the windows. No one spoke. The air felt heavy with realization as Commander Daniel Hayes stood frozen at the front of the command center. His eyes were fixed on Emily Carter, who was calmly shutting down the simulation console. When she reached for the power switch, her sleeve slipped back just enough to reveal a tattoo on her forearm, a black raven clutching a lightning bolt. The sight stopped, Hayes cold. His breath caught as he recognized the symbol. It was the same insignia painted on the nose of the A-10 that had roared out of the storm during Operation Crosswind, the one that had saved his team from annihilation. He took a step forward, voice rough and uncertain. Admitting he had seen that mark before, he said he was there, pinned down in the canyon, certain they would die, until her aircraft came through the dust. Emily didn't look up right away. When she finally did, her voice was calm, almost distant. She told him they had been lucky, that it was only part of the job. The operators around the room exchanged glances, realization spreading like a slow wave. The quiet woman they had mocked was the pilot who had defied orders, flown into chaos, and brought every man home alive. The same call sign they had laughed at now hung in the air with new weight. Hayes straightened his posture, his expression shifting from disbelief to reverence. He took a step forward, his boots echoing softly across the tile. He raised his hand in a crisp salute. It was not the salute of a commander to a subordinate, but of a soldier honoring the one who saved his life. His voice steadied as he asked for permission to address her properly as Captain Carter. Emily hesitated. She said she no longer held command. Her words quiet but firm. Hayes didn't lower his hand. He replied that she always would. For a heartbeat, no one moved. Then, one by one, every Marine, SEAL, an Air Force officer stood. The sound of boots striking the floor filled the room in unison. Hands rose to brows in perfect military precision. The silence that followed was deep, solemn, and complete. Emily's breath caught. Her composure faltering for the first time, she looked around at the faces turned toward her. The same men who once laughed, now standing in unwavering respect. Her eyes softened, the tension in her shoulders easing. There was no pride in her expression, no triumph, only a quiet peace. She gave a small nod, acknowledging them not as subordinates, but as brothers in arms. The moment held, suspended in reverent stillness. The sound of rain mingling with the echo of discipline, rediscovered. For the first time in years, Emily Carter was no longer a ghost. She was seen, honored, and finally home. The hangar was quiet, its vast space filled with the low hum of overhead lights and the lingering scent of oil and cold metal. It was well past 2300 hours, and the base outside had gone still. Emily Carter stepped through the side door. the sound of her boots echoing softly across the concrete floor. Her shadow moved between the silent outlines of aircraft, each one sleeping under its own layer of dust. The air felt heavy, timeless, the kind of quiet that holds memory in every sound. She walked past training drones and utility vehicles until she reached the far end of the hangar. There, under a faded tarp, rested an old A-10 Thunderbolt II. Its broad wings stretched wide in the half-light, its frame dull with age but unmistakable in form. On the rack beside it sat her helmet. The paint was chipped, the visor scratched, the Iron Raven insignia barely visible beneath the wear. She picked it up carefully, brushing away a thin film of dust. The weight of it was familiar, grounding, like shaking hands with an old friend she hadn't seen in years. For a long moment, she just stood there. The hum of the lights filled the silence, steady and unbroken. Then, faintly, she heard it not in the room, but in her memory. The sharp crackle of radio static, a voice calling for cover, panic bleeding through the noise. Her own younger voice answered, calm and sure, saying she was already on the deck. The echo faded until only the present remained. The hum of electricity and the whisper of rain outside. Emily set the helmet back on the rack. Her movements gentle, almost reverent. She looked up at the A-10. Its shape still powerful, even after years of stillness. The dull gray metal caught the light, reflecting it in soft patches that shimmered like ghosts of old missions. Her expression was peaceful now. Her shoulders relaxed. The weight she carried finally at rest. She turned toward the exit, her footsteps steady and unhurried. At the doorway, she paused for one last glance. The aircraft, the helmet, the empty hangar, all of it stood silent, unchanged, but no longer haunted. As she stepped into the cool night air, the camera lingered on the stillness she left behind. The Iron Raven had found her peace, and the sound of her absence filled the room like quiet honor. Under the quiet lights of the hangar, the helmet sat where she had left it. The Iron Raven insignia caught the glow just enough to remind anyone looking that it had once seen fire, sand, and sky. The space around it was still, but not empty. It carried the kind of silence that belongs to those who gave everything and asked for nothing in return. Some heroes never make the headlines. They do their work, carry the weight, and fade into the background when the mission ends. Emily Carter was one of them. From laughter to silence, from silence to salute. Her story became more than a tale of redemption. It became a reminder that true strength doesn't shout, it endure. The measure of courage is not found in medals or titles, but in the quiet moments when no one is watching. Somewhere beyond those walls, another dawn was already forming, and another generation would rise to take her place. But the legacy she left behind wasn't in records or reports. It lived in the respect of those who once doubted her, and in the memory of the skies she refused to abandon. The Iron Raven would never fly again. Yet her name would move through every call sign whispered with reverence. For every soldier who carries courage in silence, for every heart that serves without applause. This story is for you. The mission may end, but the honor never does.